go. This is going to be a really good debate, guys, because I never have had this many technical problems, but I'm super excited about this. I'm your host, Caleb Harrelson, the host of the Engaged Truth Show. And normally what we do on the show is we test popular claims and objections against Christianity. We have people come on for interviews. And tonight we have a little different model. We have a very special episode for you guys tonight. So I'm super excited to be able to offer this to you. And I hope you can find us on our Engaged Truth YouTube channel or our Engaged Apologetics Facebook page. And you can also find our podcast. This episode will be up there later on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. We're on all these different platforms. You can find us on there and be asking yourself, well, a debate, this is different than your normal interviews and episodes. Well, debate is actually, I'd say it's like a virtue. It's good to be able to engage with people who have different worldviews than us, different presuppositions, different starting point, come to different conclusions. It's good to think through ideas and why people are coming to these conclusions. And, a lot of times in our culture, you see people debating. Maybe you're watching this on Facebook and you're like, man, I don't want anything to do with that because I know we need to engage. We need to learn how to engage in healthy conversation. It forces us to think about other subjects and positions and think about them deeply. And it can challenge our viewers or listeners to this episode tonight. I hope it'll do that. It'll challenge you to rethink your position and to think through it more deeply. In the end, I think we need to engage with the truth no matter the consequences. And so tonight we have a very important topic. Does the soul exist? And it has big implications if the affirmative is true or the negative is true in regards to worldview of materialism or a theistic Christian worldview has big implications in that regards. And today I have joining me two special guests who will be debating this topic, Eric Hernandez and Adam Redwine. How are you guys doing tonight?
Doing great, thanks.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to give you guys here about a minute to just briefly introduce yourself and just the position taking at the debate here. Eric Hernandez, if you'll go ahead and go first.
Yeah, my name is Eric Hernandez. I'm the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. I'll be defending the position that the soul does exist. And I want to say thank you to Adam and to Caleb for having us on for this discussion.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Thank you. It's good to have you on here tonight, Eric. And Adam, if you'll go ahead and introduce yourself to us.
Yeah, hi, Adam Redwine. I was an engineer for about 8 years. Before that, got degrees in physics and nuclear engineering, currently studying nuclear engineering, and I'll be defending the materialist perspective that no soul exists.
Very good. Well, it's good to have you with us tonight, Adam. I know we just recently became friends online, and I'm looking forward to a very engaging discussion tonight. So the debate expectations, real simply, are no ad hominem attacking each other. We want to encourage you guys to attack and critique ideas. No inflammatory or derogatory. We want to encourage you guys not to interrupt during each other's opening or closing statements or rebuttals, but we will have a time for cross-examine. I'll get to that here in a little bit. And I also want to encourage you guys to respect your time limits. This is a fun topic, and you guys, I know, are both very knowledgeable. But I know some of our viewers will want to go to sleep eventually. I know Adam is really interesting because Adam is from Israel right now. It's the morning right now. What time is it, Adam?
It's just after 5 in the morning.
All right. Yeah, I'm having coffee at night, but I know yours has got to be a little extra strong.
Oh yeah, got a lot of it.
Yes, sir. So the format for tonight, we're going to start off with 20-minute introduction or 20-minute introductory or opening statement, excuse me. And so Adam will go first. Eric will go first, and then Adam. And then you'll each have a 10-minute rebuttal. And then from there, we'll have a 15-minute cross-examination and then 10-minute closing statements. After that, any of our viewers who have any questions or comments for Eric or Adam, just go on YouTube or the Facebook page, and we hope to get to those questions at the end. So without further ado, Eric, if you want to go ahead and get ready, and you can share your screens and take it from there with your opening statement.
Yeah, thank you. Let me get it set up really quick. Okay. All right, so let me rewind there. First, I want to start by saying so the topic of the debate is, does a soul exist? And I want to start by saying that this debate is not a scientific debate, and that would be the case for a few reasons. First, this would be a category fallacy. The soul, if it exists, would be a non-physical entity, and science, by definition, would be a discipline that studies the physical. Thus, while science is a wonderful tool for investigating the physical world, it would have virtually nothing to say about the non-physical. In fact, I would say that science in principle cannot even ask the question, much less answer it. Moreover, some of the leading neuroscientists in the world, like Jeffrey Schwartz and Mario Beauregard, believe in the soul, and no one can say that they believe in this because they don't understand the neuroscience, especially given that these are some of the leaders in neuroscience. Second, or moreover, any view regarding the nature of consciousness and the soul would be what is called empirically equivalent, meaning there would be no piece of empirical data that one could give that would lend support specifically to one view over the other. To put it differently, both Adam and I will agree on all the empirical data, but the conclusions drawn from that data will be philosophical in nature and not scientific, and that is because these kind of questions are philosophical questions about metaphysics and not science. Once you start asking such questions, you leave the field of science and enter the field of philosophy, and more particularly metaphysics. As atheist philosopher of science Michael Ruse says, science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise that it does not give certain answers. So appealing to science to answer the question tonight would be like appealing to a ruler to measure your weight. It is simply the wrong tool for the assessment. Now, with that being said, my case tonight is going to be two basic points. The first is that consciousness is not physical. That is to say that mental states and properties are neither identical nor reducible to physical states and properties of the brain. And the second point would be that I am more than my brain and body, that I am a soul. Now, let's start by giving some definitions. The soul, I would define as an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness, along with its states and properties, and animates the body. Put it differently, the soul is a self, the conscious subject. So we could say that I have a body, but I don't, quote, have a soul, but rather I am a soul, and a body without a soul is just a corpse. Now, in order to understand the arguments that I'll be using, it's important to understand something called Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, or we can just call it Leibniz's law, or the law of identity for short. So with this in mind, let's explain this really quick. So according to Leibniz's law of identity, if two things in question are the same thing, say A and B, then it would be the case that whatever is true of one is going to necessarily be true of the other. And that's because we're talking about one thing and just using two different names. Say like water and H2O, we're using two references, but we're still talking about the same substance. However, in principle, given Leibniz's law of identity, if you can find something true of one that is not true of the other and vice versa, then by default, they cannot be the same thing. So if there's something true of one, not the other, then they're not the same thing. Now, with that being said, let's look at the case here for my first point, that consciousness is not physical. And again, by that, I mean that mental states and properties are neither identical nor reducible to physical states and properties of the brain. Let's start by defining something. So consciousness, much like to think about it, much like water can come in three different states, solid, liquid, and gas, consciousness is something that we define ostensibly, meaning that we're going to point to examples and give instances and examples of it. And there are 5 states of consciousness. You have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will or volition. Now, if physicalism is true, and if Adam's position is correct, then the conscious states and properties of the mind are going to be identical to the physical states and properties of the brain. And given Leibniz's law of identity, then whatever properties that my mental states have, if they're just brain states, then they're going to have to necessarily share the same properties. However, again, if they don't share the same properties, and if I can find just one example where there's something true of one state and not true of the other, then by default, that alone would show that they are not the same thing. And this is actually quite easy to do. So for the sake of time, let's just mention a few. Pertinent to Adam's position, given that this was a last minute thing because Adam had to fill in, which I appreciate him doing, he was kind enough to answer some questions in an email. And in the email, he says that consciousness and the brain, he says it's analogous to something like an engine running. So we've got 3 things in question here. Let's lay this out. So given his analogy of an engine running, you have the engine the state that the engine it's running, and then the properties of that state. So an engine running can have the property of being something like fast or slow or loud. So with respect to this debate, we have three things in question as well. Me, the self, the conscious subject, and then we have the states of consciousness and then the properties of consciousness. Now, for Adam's position of strict physicalism to be true, it would follow then that the states and properties of consciousness would literally have to be the same thing as the states and properties of the brain. But again, this is easily proven to be demonstrably false. So take one of the conscious states of, say, something like a thought. If Adam is going to want us to believe that they're literally the same thing as a brain state, then again, like I said, necessarily they're going to have to share the same properties, but they clearly don't. How so? Well, a thought, which is a brain state, can have the property of being true or false, but take a brain state in which my neurons are firing. So we know that mental states are indeed correlated with physical states of the brain, but a correlation does not establish identity. In other words, the state of a thought can be true or false, but my brain state in which my neurons firing are not true or false. I wouldn't even know what that means. Let's go back to his engine running analogy. The engine running is a functional state of the engine, but calling mental states nothing more than functional states of the brain don't help his case because we have the same problem. Again, how so? Because functions they either are or they are not, but functional states are not the kind of things that can be true or false. A car running, a toilet flushing, or a brain state with neurons firing are all functionings, but runnings, flushings, and firings, again, are not the kind of things that can be true or false. And thus, mental states cannot be reducible to nor identical with any physical states of the brain. Let's look at something like first person private access, that my mental states are something that I have privileged access to, but this is not so of the physical states in the brain. In other words, a neuroscientist can open my skull and look at my neurons and my brain states, but they cannot open my skull and look at my thoughts. That is because consciousness is a first person privileged access kind of thing. So while a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, he can never know more about my mental life than I do. In other words, I can see a function, but I can't see a thought. Now, another thing, and again, there's a lot more to unpack, but just to briefly mention a few other things. Mental states have what's called intentionality, but my brain states don't. For example, when Adam said that consciousness is a particular category of a brain state and that the brain is what possesses consciousness. But say, for example, when I'm hungry, there are certain neurons firing, but my neurons aren't hungry. When I have a sensation of itching, I'm itching, but it makes no sense to say that those neurons that are firing are itchy. And that is because these type of brain states don't have intentionality. Now, again, while there's a lot more examples we can go through, I think it's sufficient to show that given that we know that there are things true of mental states that are not true of brain states and vice versa, I say again, then they cannot reduce one to the other and they can't be identical. Instead, as I already mentioned, if he wants to show that consciousness is merely a physical state of the brain, he's going to have to show that they share the same properties. And again, I would say that they don't. A cause or dependence, really quick, just to mention, is not the same thing as identity. You can show that there are correlations or cause and effect relations or dependence relations, but it doesn't show they're the same thing. And I'll just leave it at that and save more unpacking for the interaction. Irreducibility of consciousness, well, I won't have the time to go into it. This is a problem that many atheist philosophers of mine have pointed out. Thomas Nagel, in his book, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False, he argues you can't get mind from matter. Colin McGinn says that any naturalistic explanation for consciousness borders on sheer magic. And then you have even someone like Jaegwon Kim in his book, Philosophy of Mind, where Moreland summarizes his position in saying that correlations are not explanations, but are in fact the very thing that need explaining. So again, I just reiterate that showing correlations or cause and effect dependencies does not establish identity, that they're the same thing. Another argument I want to go into that I didn't have time to make a slide for, but I want to at least mention this, is that an argument from the unified visual field. And I know Brandon Rickable, I think I saw he was watching, so if I butcher this, please forgive me. So we know that when a person looks at an object like a table, the brain doesn't treat the awareness of the table as a unity, as a unified visual field. And that is because different regions of the brain are correlated with processing different aspects of the object. So one part of the brain is correlated with the shape, another is the size, the color, whether or not it's emotion, and so forth. But there is no region of the brain that puts these objects back together into a unified visual field. Why not? Well, because for something like this, you would need something that would have to ground all of your experiences in a single substantial subject that owns these experiences in order to have this unified visual field. Philosopher Eric Larock gives the illustration, and I'm going to modify it to kind of make it my own. Imagine there are 5 chefs in 5 separate kitchens, and each chef is individually working on a part of a one recipe. Now, even if all 5 of these chefs are working on their respective recipe at the same time, it doesn't follow that any one single chef is working on the recipe as a whole. In fact, I just even mentioned Dr. Rickable, I just got his PhD, congratulations, had even mentioned that it's even worse for the naturalist because these brain states, neurons are not conscious. But in a syllogistic format, we can say, I am either an aggregate, a collection of parts, or a soul. Well, aggregates do not have a unified visual field. Premise 3, I do have a unified visual field. Therefore, premise 4, I am not an aggregate, I am a soul. Now, let's look at the second point, that I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. Now, again, we're going to have to appeal to Leibniz's law of identity. If I'm nothing more than a brain and body, then I'm what we would call a mereological aggregate, and we can just call it aggregate for short, which would be a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. But there are certain things true of aggregates that are not true of me. To give just a quick example, when it comes to the nature of these kind of artifacts or aggregates, we know that its existence and identity is necessarily dependent on its parts and its structure. So, for example, if you take a tricycle is what it is in virtue that it has 3 wheels. But the moment you remove one of the wheels, it then becomes a bicycle. And this shows us again that for these purely physical objects, their existence and identity is necessarily dependent on the existence and identity of its parts. And this would also go to show that aggregates do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. Think of something like a car. If we take, let's say you take a car and you replace, and let me see if that's, yeah. Well, I'll say that for the next argument. Sorry, I got at a place of which argument came first. Let's look at the indivisibility of personhood. So if I'm a purely physical object or an aggregate, or I am an immaterial soul, well, purely physical objects can be divided and come in percentages or degrees. However, I cannot be divided or come in percentages or degrees because I am an all or nothing kind of thing. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Now, to understand the argument, it's important to understand the notion of degreed and non-degreed properties. Now, if I possess a property being a person, then it's going to have to be grounded in something, because what we know, and what I probably should have said before I went into the second point, was anytime you have these properties existing in the world, we know that properties don't just show up in the world all by themselves. They're always going to be possessed or owned by something more basic than themselves. So conscious states and properties exist, and what possesses those things? Well, I do. Well, what am I is what becomes the next question. Well, note the argument, I'm either a purely physical object like an aggregate or an immaterial soul. Now, with degreed properties, take personhood. If I'm nothing more than a brain and body, then personhood would be a degreed property. A degreed property is something like the property of being loud or hard. Something can be louder or quieter, and something can be hard or harder. So they can fluctuate, they can exist in percentages or degrees. Same applies with physical objects. You can have a half of a table or half of a door and so forth. But contrast that with non-degreed properties, something like the property of being even. The number 2 and the number 6 are both even, but it makes no sense to say that the number 6 is more even than the number 2. And that is because the property of being even is not a degreed property. It's an all or nothing kind of thing. It either is or it isn't, and there is no in between. So it would make sense again, though, to say that if I cut a table in half, I could have 50% of a table. But if you cut off my arms and legs, it doesn't make sense to say that you have 50% of a person. That is because personhood is an all or nothing kind of thing. It's a non-degreed property. Now, if, however, you ground personhood in merely my brain and body, then it's going to fluctuate and exist in percentages or degrees. But again, I think this wouldn't make sense. And now if you just appeal to the brain, you have the same problem, especially when you look at Dandy-Walker syndrome, or I think it's anencephalic syndrome, where some people are born with just maybe 90% of a brain or 50% of a brain. Well, they're not 50% persons. They're still 100% full persons, because again, personhood is not a decreed property. But if you're going to be a physicalist, I would argue it's going to lead to personhood being a physical property. Identity through change. And I can see that I'm running low on time. So I am either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. If I am a purely physical object, then I do not retain identity through change. I do maintain identity through change. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Jaegwon Kim, the atheist philosopher I mentioned earlier, he gives an argument in his book where he says something like to consider this brain and body. So it's alleged that every 7 to 10 years, we replace virtually every cell in our body. He says, well, in 2011, this body did not exist, but I did exist in 2011. Therefore, I am not identical or reducible to this brain and body. Suppose a different illustration. I commit a crime 7 to 10 years ago, but they just now find the evidence. Well, if the officers were to come to my door and say, we just found the evidence to convict you, it would make no sense for me to say, well, officer, don't you know that we're just reducible to a brain and body aggregate, and that brain and body doesn't exist anymore? So you can't arrest me because I'm not the same person. Go find that guy, but good luck, he doesn't exist. Obviously, I'm still going to jail because we know that we retain identity through change. Free will. The argument from free will, I can put as follows. I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. Premise 2, if I'm a purely physical object, then I do not possess free will. And by free will, I mean libertarian free will. I do possess free will. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. Now, by libertarian free will, I mean essentially being the originator or source of your will or actions. Now, the reason this can't be the case if you're a purely physical object, consider the following illustration. So Aristotle said, if I move a rock with my staff, then I know that the staff moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, but then he asked what moved me. Now, if you're going to be a physicalist, and if there is no God, then arguably the law of causal closure would be true, which is the view that the law that every physical event is necessarily going to have a prior physical cause. So if the physicalist is going to answer the question, what moved me, then if he's going to want to possess libertarian free will, he's going to have to say that this started with him as the first mover. So you're going to have to point to something like, let's say, a neuron firing. Well, that's fine and dandy, but given the law of causal closure, you're going to have to explain that neuron firing by some prior physical event. Well, here's where the two options, you're reduced to two options. The first option is you can say, well, another neuron firing caused that neuron to fire. But then again, given the law of causal closure, that physical event was still a physical event and would need a prior physical cause. What you can eventually do is you can keep positing neurons, but firing, but then you're going to lead into infinite regress and the action would never occur. So the second option, which I think is the only one left, is at some point you're going to have to posit that something external and prior to yourself, causally determined by other physical factors, led to the point to where you were caused to move by that brain firing, but it was caused by something external to you. And now you are not the first mover, but instead just an intermediate secondary mover in a causal chain of events. And given that you're not the first mover, you do not have free will. Now, Adam might say, I don't know his position on it, but he might say, well, so what? I don't believe in free will. Well, if you're going to give up libertarian free will, I would argue you're going to have to further give up two things: moral responsibility and intellectual integrity or rational responsibility. And here's what I mean by that. If I murder someone with a gun, although it's true that the bullet is what penetrated his heart, we don't blame the bullet because we know the bullet was not a first mover. So let's take a step back in the chain. We look at the gun. Again, we wouldn't blame the gun because just like the bullet, it wasn't a first mover. Then we come back to me, I pulled the trigger. The reason we arrest the person pulling the trigger is because we assume they're the first movers. But if there is no free will, if there's no soul and there's no free will, then you're just another, much like the gun or bullet, you're an intermediate mover. And if we don't arrest or blame the gun or bullet, we can't arrest a person because much like the gun and bullet, they were intermediate movers. So there'd be no moral responsibility. Intellectual integrity, the same thing would apply. If there is no soul and you're just purely determined, then not only are your actions causally determined by external factors beyond your control, but every thought and belief is equally causally determined. And if that's the case, then Adam's going to have to say that if there is no soul, then every belief he holds to was causally determined by external factors beyond his control. And why then should I believe what he was causally determined to believe? I would also say knowledge would be impossible on this point, because if you could never justify the truth of your beliefs, then you're stuck in this dialectical loop where you never know, you have no reason, and you have an undercutting defeater for anything you believe. Now, Adam might say, but I can test my beliefs to see if they're true, even if my beliefs are causally determined. Yes, but the problem is that even your very desire and act of testing the beliefs, and even the conclusion you come to in those tests, is still going to be something you were causally determined to do and believe in the first place. So you would essentially be saying, I believe that my beliefs are true because I was causally determined to believe that what I believe is true. And you're back to the same problem. So I would say that in summation, if consciousness exists, it can't be reducible or identical to a physical state of the brain, because mental states and properties are not shared by physical states and properties. If you're the same person from one moment to the next and you maintain identity through change, then you're going to have to be more than a brain and body. And if Adam came to freely believe that there is no free will, or freely believe that there is no soul, and if he holds people morally responsible, then he's going to actually have to say that there is a soul in order to have that kind of free will. If he didn't have that free will, then why should I freely believe what he was causally determined to believe? So we can put this all together and say, if Adam's conscious, if he is the same person from the beginning of this debate to the end of this debate, and if he freely came to believe in the positions that he holds to, well, then physicalism is false, the soul exists, and you'd have to concede the debate there. But thank you.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Now it's your turn to argue the opposition.
All right, great, thanks. Let me see, let's see. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you guys can see my slides now. Yes, okay, great.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be presenting the materials perspective. Clearly this perspective is quite a bit different than what Eric presented, but that's what we're here for. So hopefully I can at least give you a description of where I stand, even if we don't agree. I want to start with, what are humans made of? Now, obviously humans have a body. That body is composed of organs. Those organs themselves are made of cells. The cells have molecules in them, are made of molecules, which in turn are made of atoms. And those we know are composed of subatomic particles. Actually, it gets a lot more complicated than that. And I do have a few slides on physics. So I know that Eric argues that this debate is not reducible to science, but I disagree. And like I said, that's kind of the whole point. So how do those things behave? The things that make up the human body, that is. So my position is that the things that make up a human behave the same way that the laws of, that everything else does, according to the laws of physics. Now, this is a testable hypothesis. So we can test and see if the pieces of me behave the same way that other things do. We can take blood out of my body, take the iron out of that blood, put it into a steel girder, and we can test the strength and see if the steel girder behaves the same or differently as a steel girder made of iron that was pulled out of ore from the ground. So this claim at least is subject to science. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what the scientific method is, because I think this is often confused. So science is a method of investigation. It's a process. Science itself doesn't tell us anything at all. It's not an authority. It's a class of behaviors. So we can do science. We can perform science. Sorry, next slide. All right, so what is, I'm going to get into some, hopefully some ontology and physics here. Interaction is the basis on which existence is determined in physics. So from the perspective of a physicist, it doesn't even really mean anything to say that something exists if it has zero interactions. So this is kind of like the old Buddhist question about if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? Well, in physics, if something has no interaction with anything in the universe, then what do we even really mean by exists? If it can't do anything, if it can't be tested, it can't be observed, then it's really unclear even what we mean when we say it exists. Now, the nature of particle interactions is actually really well understood. We understand what these kind of interactions look like. And when I say that, I mean that the fundamental principles are very well established and verified. Now, there are specific cases that we don't always understand, so it's really difficult to apply first principles to a complex atom like, say, a uranium atom. And in theory, we could do it, but the mathematics is extremely difficult. People do these kinds of calculations with very, very large computers, and then they publish papers on them. And guys like me go pull them off of the internet and read them and try to wrap our brains around it. But it's really hard when you talk about something as complicated as a single large atom. All right, so physics includes positive and negative assertions. So in physics, we say things like space-time obeys the Einstein field equations. That would be a positive assertion. We say this is something that the universe does. We also make negative assertions. So we say, for example, there's no more than 3 generations of matter. That's something we exclude from possibility. I would say just the universe cannot operate in this way. But ultimately, all of physics is described by, I say 4 objects in 4 dimensions. This is a little bit simplified. How you count the objects, it kind of varies depending on what you're interested in and how you formulate things. But the objects are fields of the fundamental forces. There are 4 fundamental forces, and there are 4 dimensions. So these are 3 spatial and 1 temporal dimension in which things exist. All right, so a little bit more physics. Now, the mathematics that we physicists use is the physics. So there is a specific subset of mathematics that physics uses, and that mathematics is equivalent to the physics. All right, so when we say, the way that we do this is we formulate hypotheses, we write out a large series of equations, we usually provide some sort of physical interpretation of what these equations mean, and then the equations say, okay, so in this particular situation, you should expect to see this quantitative result. And then experimentalists like me, so I do experimental physics, we think, okay, well, if I designed an apparatus, I could measure this. I could test and see whether or not I like this, or whether or not this is a good hypothesis. So we go build some machine, we run the tests, and then we get some numerical result, and we look at the equations and what number we should get, and then we look at what number we did get, and we say, ask, do these things match? Now, mathematics can positively exclude some possibilities. So we can say, for example, that no 2 whole numbers divided by each other will give the square root of 2. Now, I have not gone through every possible combination of whole numbers. Nobody else has either. It's impossible to do because there are infinitely many numbers. And yet we can say that these numbers do not exist. There are simply no 2 numbers that will give you this. And we know that for a fact. Now, again, I said the mathematics is the physics. Well, so in physics, we can do the same thing. It's not this particular example of the square root of 2. The equations are unfortunately rather difficult, but we can make exclusionary statements. So we can say that insofar as these mathematical equations correctly describe the universe, we can exclude this range of physical interpretations. So this is not a correct description of how the universe behaves. And then the last line here is a little complex. I've got some more on it here coming up, but I want to say conservation laws are mathematically identical to symmetry. So symmetry is really a key concept in physics, and I hope that this will be clear a little bit later on. All right, so what does physics tell us? Well, what can we get from this understanding of the universe? Well, specific individual interactions are actually not predictable. I thought it was interesting at the end of Eric's presentation, he seemed to be saying that in a materialist perspective, you have to be able to say this was the cause of this, this was the cause of that. Well, actually, no, that's not true. In fact, we know that that is not true. The universe does not operate so that we can predict exactly individual interactions. If I have a uranium atom, I cannot tell you exactly when that uranium atom will decay. I can't. I'm a nuclear engineer and I can't do it. Nobody else can either. But that being said, I can tell you exactly what the probability is that that atom will decay within some specific amount of time. So I can tell you, if you watch this atom for this period of time, there is an X probability that you will see a decay. That I can tell you, and I can give you a very precise number of exactly how likely that is. All right, so The laws of physics, they do not change over time. This is actually related to that symmetry statement before. So we would say temporal symmetry is mathematically equivalent to the conservation of energy. The laws of physics don't change by location. So this is mathematically equivalent to the conservation of momentum. There's several others that are difficult to get through. Anybody who's interested in this, I highly recommend that you read up on a person called Emmy Noether. She was an amazing mathematician, but she mathematically proved that these are true statements. So remember back to the earlier slides where I talked about how the things that make up a human body are subject to the same laws of physics. Well, this kind of necessitates that, because what's the difference between me where I am and the air that's 3 feet to my right? Well, it's just a matter of location. It's a translation. It's a spatial distance. But the laws of physics say that they have to operate the same over those different spaces. Now, violations of these laws can be tested for. That's what we do. That's what I get paid to do. I go into a lab and I test to see, do we have some violation, something that we didn't expect based on our model of the universe. So what conclusions can we draw from these? Well, humans are physical. I'm a physical thing. This is me, physical person. I either obey the laws of physics or you can demonstrate that I don't. And if you can, I highly recommend that you write it up in a thoroughly researched paper and submit it to a journal and collect your millions of dollars and your Nobel Prize, because you will go down in history as the most important scientist ever in the world. So I want to ask, any influence on physical objects, how can you have an influence that isn't testable? So a different influence means it leads to different outcomes. So if, for example, I have a coin and I flip the coin and it's a fair coin, as 50% of the time it comes up heads, 50% of the time it comes up tails, that is a random chance, because any individual flip, I can't tell you whether it's going to be heads or tails, but I can tell you that over the course of time, it will be a 50% chance. Now, if I flip a coin a bunch of times and it comes up heads 75% of the time and tails 25% of the time, what I can tell you is that there was an influence on this coin. Something has changed this coin. Okay. Now, by definition, I can test it, because that's what a coin flip is. A coin flip is a test. Say here, I'm going to flip it, see what the result is. This is an experiment and a result. So an influence, by definition, leads to a different outcome. And that's what physics studies. Now, an influence that if you tell me, well, it has an influence, but it's not testable. So Eric says that the existence of a soul is not something that's subject to science. I'm going to tell you that that's superfluous. It's totally irrelevant. So something that has no interaction with the universe, if you say, well, there's an invisible leprechaun that exists, you can't test him. He is the cause of a rainbow, but he doesn't have any impact on the laws of physics. But I'm telling you that this invisible leprechaun exists and he causes rainbows, which behave exactly the way that you would expect a rainbow to behave just because of the laws of physics. But there's a leprechaun, believe me. I'm going to tell you that that's a very odd position to take. And I'm going to say, that claim is not convincing to me. Now, you can believe it. You're free to believe that, but I don't see any need for that kind of hypothesis. Now, similarly, an interaction that doesn't alter the laws of physics. Again, I'm going to say, if it doesn't change anything about how the universe behaves, then quite frankly, I honestly don't care about that hypothesis. All right, so let's get out of the physics, although that is my area, but I understand it's not for everybody. So the physics is mathematics, but the reason we use mathematics for physics is because mathematics is very, very precise. And in other sciences, I know Eric is very strong in philosophy, which I appreciate. There are technical meanings. So rather than using mathematics, the philosophers take words often from normal language. Sometimes they make up new words, but often they just use words that are already out there. And then they apply some very strict meaning. But I want to give people a warning that using technical language outside of an academic setting, you should take it with a grain of salt. I think that it can often be misleading. So one purpose of the peer review in academic systems is to root out errors that are due to inexact or incorrect language use. And I feel, so I'm not a philosopher, But I'm pretty sure that Eric has misused some of the technical terms of philosophy. And those are the kinds of things that in a technical or more academic setting might be caught by somebody. So on the subject of language, I want to do a little bit of linguistics. Now, quotidian language is the day-to-day language that we use. It's often a lot more ambiguous than people think. We have our thoughts, which is part of the subject, and they seem so clear to us, and then we feel like the words that come out of our mouth, usually most of us feel, are pretty close to what that thought is. But there is so much nuance, and I want, to anybody who thinks that language is really super clear and technical. I know a lot of people are sort of grammar Nazis and really say, no, it has to be exactly this way. I want to say, well, have you ever gotten into a disagreement with a romantic partner? The fact that somebody who is so close to you could not understand what you meant by what seems like a pretty clear statement is just a hint of the sort of the gray zone of language and how language use works. Now, Americans in particular tend to think of language in very prescriptive terms. There's historical reasons for this with Mr. Nathaniel Webster, but a lot of the world doesn't think that way. But I find this a lot among Americans that I talk to, that we think language is this way, it has to be this way, and it means exactly this thing. And I think that you just got to be cautious with something like that. I want you to understand that the languages can work very, very differently than what we're accustomed to. So for example, some languages conjugate words based on how you know something, like the Tayuka language, or based on the truth value. So you have to say the word differently depending on how you know this thing to be true. Some languages lack color or number or gender descriptions. And so the way that you quantify things can be described and explained very, very differently. These kinds of differences can make a huge, huge difference in how people understand arguments like the ones that we're having, or debates. And there's a couple of linguistic usages or issues that I've seen in some of Eric's material that I particularly want to address. So one is the use of a category versus an instance. So in the English language, most nouns can be either a category or an instance. So for example, a person, it's a noun, it can be a category or an instance. So in the category sense, there are a collection of things around the world that we say fit into this category of person. So I was a person before, I got into an accident, lost my arm, and hey, but I'm still a person. We're using the word person there in the category sense. So we're saying, I am still a member of this category. I have not left the category of things that we call person. But if I said something like, I'm the person who ate the last donut, I'm not talking about the category of person. I'm talking about a specific instance. I'm talking about me. This physical object is the thing that did this. It's a very subtle difference, but it's a really important one. I think that that difference is at the root of some of the issues that Eric's having here. So switching between these two feels very, very natural, but it can hide some logical errors in some of this discussion. So the law of identity in particular, we'll maybe get into it later with Eric's discussion about the tricycle. The law of identity, it applies to instances. Now you can apply it to a category, but if you're going to apply the law of identity to a category, you have to be very, very clear and specific when you're talking about the category itself rather than the instance. If you say this tricycle is a tricycle, and then you take off the wheel and it's no longer a tricycle, that's not talking about the law of identity. That's a confusion between the category and instance. Properties are things that apply to instances and help us guide categorization. So the properties that we ascribe to a person often typically don't include things like must have two arms, because we all know that there are people that don't have two arms. All right, another linguistic issue is the distinction between a label versus an object. So language provides labels. Language really is labels, and all descriptions are labels. So when I said that mathematics is the physics, I mean the math itself is the physics, but the equations that we use to write the math, those are labels. When I type out an equation on my computer, that's not the physics, that's just a label for the thing that really exists in the real world. Now, thoughts are both labels and objects. So the thought, I argue, my position, is that a thought is a collection of neural arrangements, of firings of synapses in the brain. That is what I mean when I say a thought. I mean this collection, this arrangement of physical things. But the thing that a thought does is to label something. That's the function of a thought. So my thought, if I think of the color red, uh, that's a thought. That's an arrangement in my brain. This red thought. But what that thought does is helps me label stuff. I can say Caleb's shirt is red. That helps me to categorize. But the thought itself is just those neurons firing. So where does consciousness come from then? So we know that there are physical bounds to an individual. My fingertips are here, but anything beyond that, that's not me. So there's this sort of extra layer. And where you define that can actually get really, really fuzzy because if I would say that my nail bed is a part of me, but if I clip my nails, well, that nail clipping is no longer me. So there's some really very complicated aspects to making these definitions. But a collection of physical entities composing a person has a lot of abilities like speech. I'm speaking right now, I'm thinking. And languages are useful for descriptions. So we use language to come up with these descriptions like red and shirt and categories like person or tricycle. And human brains are adept at categorization. That's what we've evolved to do. We put things into different categories. And it's natural for a brain to think, to come up with a label for itself, to have a self-referential label. And so my position is that consciousness is the brain's label for itself. Consciousness is what the brain calls itself. And I have one more slide, but I think I'll actually save that one for the closing of the rebuttal and end it out there. So thanks for your time. Take it away, Caleb.
All right. Thank you, Adam. We have 10 minutes for rebuttal from Eric now.
Okay, hold on. Let me set my time real quick. Okay. Yeah. So, with all due respect, I didn't hear an argument for physicalism or against dualism. So but I'm going to try to formulate from what I heard, try to stillman what he said. He seemed to say that the body is physical, which is question begging. It's an assertion, not an argument. And then he says, well, we know how physical things act by the laws of physics and chemistry. Therefore, there's no soul. That even if that would be put into an argument, that's still not, it doesn't follow from what he said. And in fact, even after he mentioned a lot of the things about how physical things interact and work, he says, what can we draw from this? Well, humans are physical. And then he began to say, well, therefore, there's no room or need for a soul. Again, that's an assertion with the question begging assumption put in, and there was no argument for it. So yeah, he even brought up the thing about the science. So in my opening, I said that any position regarding philosophy of mind is going to be what's called empirically equivalent, which means everything he said, I'm not going to disagree with as far as the physics goes, as far as any kind of empirical data. I'm not disagreeing with that. If I can say this kindly, none of that was relevant to any position on the soul or whether or not it does exist, unless you start with the assumption that humans are purely physical and then give me laws of physics and then conclude humans are purely physical, but that would be circular reasoning. But perhaps this illustration might help. Suppose your neighbor told you there's an invisible man in his house. And you said, okay, I want to investigate for myself. So he says, by all means, he lets you in his house and you take 3 to 4 to 5 hours to really investigate. And you come back and you're upset with your neighbor and you say, you know what? I think you're lying. And your neighbor says, why do you think I'm lying? And you said, because you told me there's an invisible man in your house, right? And your neighbor says, yeah. And you say, yeah, but I just spent 5 hours looking for him and I never saw him. I looked under the bed, I looked in the closet, I looked in the bathroom, and not once did I visibly see this invisible man. And of course, your neighbor would look at you kind of funny. Now, I'm not saying that this proves that there is an invisible man. The point to the illustration is that if you're going to try and disprove that the invisible man is not there, you cannot appeal to your sense of visibility to disprove something visible. So again, I would say that science it's a category error to try and use science to try and prove or disprove the soul. It would be like it's a category fallacy, much like using a ruler to measure your weight. It's simply the wrong tool for the assessment. If I say, how much do I weigh? I don't grab a ruler, I grab a scale. So it's still the case that it is a category error. And I'm curious to hear anything otherwise, any objections to that. it's also interesting. I found that he said that it's he's cautious about using technical terms outside of, I think he said, like academic fields or something, and yet his entire presentation had technical terms regarding physics, which I'm fine with. I have no problem with technical terms as long as you define them and use them. But if you're going to say that we shouldn't use them outside of academic fields, he just did what he said we shouldn't do. And then I also found it interesting that he said, and I hope he doesn't take this the wrong way. He said, I'm not a philosopher, but I'm pretty sure Eric used some of those philosophical terms in the wrong way. Well, how would you know? Unless you knew the field of philosophy of mind and knew the terms that I was using. I'm not saying you're right or wrong. I'm just saying it's a weird way to kind of phrase what you said there. And the terms that I use aren't, quote, my terms. These are terms within the philosophy of mind and terms that are used by the scholars and leaders in this field. So another interesting thing is that after even talking about terms, he then begins to give us terms that he's going to define and say difference about labels and categories. Well, now you're bringing in your own, quote, technical terms that may be used in an idiosyncratic way to define something, and then you're doing, again, the same thing that you said that we shouldn't do. But within philosophy of mind, there are very technical terms, and these aren't terms that he says something like you take terms that are out there and then use them in your own way. No, like something like the term substance, an immaterial substance. Substance was first used by philosophers, and then science later picked it up. So this isn't something that like a philosopher goes out and says, let me pick a word and then let me just kind of adopt and use it for myself. Substance goes as far back to the guys who we stand on their shoulders. You look at Aristotle, Aquinas, and stuff like that. They're talking about substances. So we have technical terms. We have substances. So in this discussion, the relevant categories would be substances, states and events, and properties. And it's something that I alluded to earlier on. So we actually are using technical terms and label categories. You did say something that I did agree with about that properties are a type of guide. Absolutely. When you can identify the property of something, it gives us an idea of what the thing that possesses its nature is. So when we talk about essence and nature, then we're talking and we look at the properties, it's going to give us an idea of what that thing is. When you look at mental states and properties, they are not identical to physical states and properties of anything like the brain or anything else physical. So what he said actually was in favor of my view. He also brought, so he talked about labeling. So it's also important, again, using technical terms, to understand the nature of even properties themselves. When you look at something's nature or essence, there are necessary properties and there are accidental, or what we call contingent properties. So sure, if, in other words, if let's say I lose my arms and legs, but I'm still me, or as he put it, I still fall under the category of being human. Sure, but that gives us an example of the kind of thing that nature is. It shows us that having arms and legs are not necessary attributes of being a person. And it, furthermore, if you're just a brain and body, if you're going to reduce personhood to just a brain and body aggregate, then it's going to fluctuate in common degrees, as I mentioned. So it's important to understand essential properties versus contingent properties. But if I can lose certain parts and still be me, then it follows that those properties were not necessary for my existence, which goes to lend credibility to my arguments. He said a thought is a correlation or arrangement of physical things. Now, that I thought was really interesting, and we can get more into the discussion and cross-examination. But go back to my argument about consciousness not being identical to any states of the brain, and you'll see I already showed that it can't merely be an arrangement of neurons. And then you have to even ask, how does this happen? I know he's going to appeal to calling consciousness an emergent property, but slapping a label on something doesn't solve the problem. And consciousness is not the kind of thing that you get by simply rearranging matter and particles. In other words, if I got 100 red bricks and I rearrange them and give them a different structure, I'm not going to get the color blue, because the color blue is not something you get by simply rearranging or adding red bricks. So you can't, I'm curious to hear how he's going to say that these atoms to cells to neurons, when you add so many, all of a sudden, presto, you're going to get consciousness. This is not something that is you can call it an emergent property, but there's a lot more problems we can get into. At best, you can get epiphenomenalism that has its own set of problems that still wouldn't allow for free will. And let me even hit something on that. In his opening, he basically said, he asserted that human beings are just physical. In fact, he said, what are humans made of? And then he began to list physical things. Well, I think more appropriately, he should have said, what are human bodies made of? But to say what are humans made of is to simply, again, beg the question that human beings are purely physical. And it's just to simply assume that physicalism is true. But he said, what are humans made of? Then he listed physical stuff. And then he began to talk about the laws of physics and said, well, this is how we operate. If that's the case, it only lends credibility to my argument that you won't be able to have free will. If you don't have free will, then everything you believe is causally determined. Why should I believe that? Did you freely come to believe it yourself? You can't have more responsibility and so forth. So, I'll leave it at that, and we'll looking forward to the rest of it.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Now we have 10-minute rebuttal from Adam.
Great, thanks. Appreciate it. All right, so took some notes during your opening. Let's see. I think I can probably do it in quite a bit under 10 minutes. So I look forward to the Q&A section. All right, so one thing I particularly wanted to address in your statements, Eric talked about how thoughts could be true or false, and he offered this as an example of how the brain is not the same as the thought, because the truth can the thought can be true or false, but the brain isn't true or false. Well, okay, I agree that the thought can be true or false, or true or false can be good labels for a thought. I agree that a physical brain is itself not true or false, but that doesn't mean that the brain is there's anything more going on with the brain than just a physical thing. So I am an experimental physicist. I do most of my work on signal analysis, but I do a lot of computer programming, and I use very large, powerful computers. And those computers are physical. They're, as far as I understand, they are entirely, completely physical. They have no soul. They have no consciousness. They don't have any thoughts, but they absolutely can have true or false statements in them. And in fact, that's what a computer does. It's a big collection of true statements and false statements and comparisons of those. So from Eric's perspective, if he's going to argue that the fact that a thought can be true or false proves somehow that there is some immaterial, otherworldly kind of thing going on, then he's also going to have to hold the position that a computer has a soul. And I don't see how that holds. I expect he wouldn't take that position. He also talked about different parts, and he's given some statements on properties and how properties of parts of something translate to the properties of the larger whole. For example, in his introduction, he talked about how if I'm itchy, I have neurons, and the neurons send a signal, but the neurons themselves aren't itchy. I'm itchy. Okay, I agree with that. He also talked about how when you're hungry, your stomach is sending you signals, but it's not the stomach that's hungry, it's you that's hungry. Well, sure, that's fine, but again, that doesn't refute the point. I appreciate it. He did mention the analogy that I'd given him earlier in an email about how a brain is in some sense like an engine, and the consciousness is the state of the brain, in the same way that an engine's running state is a state of the engine. Well, a piston that's in an engine isn't running. The piston doesn't have the state of the engine of being running. The piston is going up and down. The piston's moving. It's doing whatever it's doing. The engine body isn't running. The engine is running. Well, of course, the part of the thing isn't running, but nobody said it is. So just because, the neurons are sending signals and the neuron isn't hungry or isn't itchy, but I am, well, so what? Because the I that I'm talking about in the sentence, I'm hungry or I'm itchy, isn't the neuron. I'm not saying that I am the neuron and it is itchy. What I'm saying is that this collection, this whole thing that I call me, my brain's label for myself, this thing is itchy. This composite whole is itchy, in the same way that an engine as a composite whole is running. He also talked about aggregate properties, and this is actually complex, and it's honestly a kind of a sensitive subject, where he talks about how he doesn't believe that personhood is degreed. He got into it more in a little bit of the other stuff, where he talked about you can't have, part of a person. He said a person's not just a brain and a body complex. But honestly, I feel like if you really think about it, really dig in and start looking at examples, that's not the case. I actually think it is possible to have less of a person. It doesn't sound good, but it's true. My grandmother died of Alzheimer's. She spent years wasting away. And I will tell you, over the course of 5 years, she was a different person. She was entirely changed. Alzheimer's is very common. I know a lot of people have family members who struggle with this. It's a terrible disease. It's horrible to watch. But I tell you, it does change who you are. And no, it doesn't take you out of the category of being a person. But yeah, it does change that person. I actually have another slide. Maybe I'll show it later. But the degrees of personness, like I said, it can be a sensitive issue. If we want to get into talking about conjoined twins and fetus in fetu, some of these phenomenon where you have an embryo that splits up, I know a lot of Christians take the position that personhood starts at fertilization. I certainly don't hold that. But if personhood starts at fertilization and then an egg splits up and becomes twins, totally separate twins, but twins, are those not two people? I would argue that those are two people. But if you believe that personhood starts at fertilization, you either have to argue that that fertilized egg had two people in it, or that one person came about after another, or divider. You have to come up with some explanation. Whereas in my view, I have a pretty natural explanation. I say that personhood is the composite of the neurons and the brains and synapses, and we can identify and watch those brains and synapses develop. All right, so let's see, what else do we have? Oh, he talked about the prime mover, and how at the end of his presentation, his intro, he talked about how in materialism you have to have a cause for something. And he said, oh, well, you look at, the staff moved the rock, but I moved the staff. Well, what moved me? And it's very good, interesting history of philosophy. But that's not true, that in a materialistic view, everything has to have a direct cause. I gave the example of a uranium atom. I'm a nuclear engineer. I'm an experimental physicist. I work in the field of neutrino experiments, neutrino studies, and I can't tell you when a specific atom is going to decay. I can't. It's not possible. So when an atom decays, and they do decay, we can watch this. When an atom decays, what are you going to tell me is the cause of that? If you know, please do tell me, but I don't know. I can tell you the theory and the physics and describe all of the properties, and I can describe the influences and the fields that will promote that decay, and I can calculate whether it's going to happen quickly or slowly on average. But any specific individual decay, I don't know. I can't tell you what the cause is. So no, it's not true that in a materialist view, you have to be able to identify the precise cause of every action. That's just not how it works. And then, yeah, so one last point, I guess, on the use of technical language. And I appreciate your careful attention to my presentation. I didn't say that we shouldn't use technical language. I said that we should be cautious when we use technical language. Technical language is fine. I think it's appropriate. It's even fine in these discussions. I don't object to your using it. In fact, I borrowed one of your technical terms. You talked about the law of identity in your material, and I took that and incorporated it into mine. This is fine. It's okay to talk about these things. But we just need to be cautious. We need to be careful, try to be as clear as we can, and have these discussions. It's all about learning from each other, hopefully, and having a good discussion. So I think that's it for my rebuttal for now.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Adam, for sharing that. And we're going to go into 15-minute cross-examination. Eric will ask Adam questions, and then we'll vice versa. After that will be Adam's turn to ask Eric.
All right, let me set the timer again. Okay. So, let's see where to start. Could you describe to me in purely physical terms my belief that the ball is red? How would you describe that in purely physical terms?
I would say your belief that the ball is red is a particular arrangement and collection of the neurons in the synapses in your brain. As to which specific neurons and synapses, obviously I can't identify. I'm just looking at you on a webcam. If we had you in an fMRI machine, we could certainly get a lot better. We could talk about which regions of the brain were correlated with that. And, in theory, I don't know how close we could get. We could probably get pretty close to identifying exactly which physical things correlate to that thought.
So, you described to me neurons. How does that tell me that my belief that the ball is red? Describing neurons, how does that? Could you elaborate on that?
So I'm not quite sure I follow. So the thought is the collection of the state of these neurons. That when I say that's your thought, that's what I mean. So if you say, well, how does that work? It'd be like me saying, well, the basketball is the collection of latex molecules in air. And then you saying, well, how does that work? Why?
Well,
that's what it is. That's
yeah,
what I mean.
Well, if I can push back, so even using the illustration of the basketball, so you can. I'm not denying that there can be an existence of something like a structural property. So if I get a pile of wood, I can call it a pile, but then I can rearrange the structure, maybe even add some more panels of wood, and I can get a raft. And it's a structural property, and we can see how that happens. And describing the raft, I can describe everything physical about it, and it could be exhaustively described. But describing to me neurons and a collection of neurons, I don't get, therefore, this is a belief that the ball is red. Looking at my neurons tells me nothing about my beliefs. What would you say to something like that, or how would you solve that?
I would say that if you took apart a computer hard drive and you looked at it and you inspected it with a microscope and you picked it apart and you really tried to figure out what was going on, you'd have a very, very difficult time taking meaningful information off of that. I mean, you'd really have to know what you were doing to get anything meaningful out of it. And yet we can have on a computer hard drive video of the basketball or of a pile of wood or a raft or whatever. That category of thing can exist within the memory, even if it's very difficult to describe in terms.
So this is something I want to get back to that because that would bring up something else I'd like to talk about. But so you did concede that you said you admitted that yes, those group of neurons firings aren't true or false, but you said something like that doesn't mean that there's something else going on. Yet, given Leibniz's law of identity, if my group of neurons firing aren't true or false, then how, in any sense, could that be a thought if it doesn't share the properties of a thought?
So true and false are labels. They're very useful labels, but they're labels that we apply as a part of our language to describe whether or not something correlates to observation. If I say the cap of this pen is black, then you and Caleb look at it and we say, okay, it's black. But that's the reason we say that that is a true statement, is because we have understanding of what we mean by words like black and color, and then we have this large complex of things, and then we can correlate and say, well, the physical reality of this thing correlates to this group of concepts about color and blackness. So that's what we mean by true.
Well, right. So yes, a proposition can be true or false, and the contents of my thought can contain propositions. But I guess I'm gonna go back to what I said. If you're going to concede that neurons aren't true or false and they can't be thoughts, and all you did was explain a correspondence theory of truth, but that doesn't answer the question. In what sense is a group of neurons a thought if my group of neurons aren't true or false?
In what sense is a group of neurons your thoughts if the group of so the group of neurons as a physical thing correlates to some thought. So we talked about what's the thought of redness, okay? So I said we could put you in fMRI and see kind of what parts of your brain correlate to red as a thought. And then we can hold up a disc in front of you and say, is this color red? And you can say yes or no.
Just for the sake of time, Can I interrupt you? Is that if you
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
mind?
please.
I noticed you said correlate,
Yeah.
but your position is that it is that a thought is identical to a group of nouns. So
Yeah, the
why did
correlation
you
is
change?
for truth. That's how we define truth value. True things correlate, untrue things don't correlate. So the correlation is how we define what we mean by the word truth. I think that you're taking truth as this big philosophical concept of this is a universal thing, and I think that that is a misunderstanding.
Well, truth is universal. The number two is necessarily even, and that's a universal truth.
I think that things like the number two and the concept of even are human concepts. They're very useful concepts, but I don't think that there's a universality of that. I don't think that the
So
universe itself
is
cares or has this concept. It's a human that
well,
has.
well, yeah, but I don't care what the universe cares about, so it's kind of irrelevant. Do you believe that the number two being even is necessarily true?
I think that the number two being even is necessarily true in the sense that I am a speaker of the English language and a user of mathematics, and I understand these concepts, and I believe that concepts provide a good, internally consistent correlated
yes.
system.
So would that be a yes? Okay, then it can't be a human construct because then it would be contingent. So there has to be universal objective truth in that sense. Let me ask you this: if I think of a pink elephant, where is that thought located?
It's located in your brain. Again, we can put you in an fMRI,
Okay.
ask you to think about
So
it.
hold on. Well, okay. Well, yeah. Let's run with that. Put me in an fMRI, even though I'm not sure if that's how that works. But you would be able to see a pink elephant in my brain?
No. Would I be able to see a video of a basketball if I pulled apart my computer hard drive right now and looked at the shiny little disc? No, of course not. So
Right. So that
doesn't
shows
mean it's
right.
not there.
No. Therefore, it's not the same thing.
So if I pull out the hard drive and I look at the shiny disc and I don't see a basketball, you're saying that I can conclude, therefore, there is no video of a basketball on my hard drive?
No, I'm saying therefore the visual basketball is not the same thing as the thing you're holding in your hand.
I agree that the neural structure in your brain does not look the same as a red basketball.
Right. So the thought is not the same thing.
So you're assuming that the brain must physically look like the thought that you have, and that's just not.
Well, no, I'm saying that based on your view, a logical implication of that. If a thought is nothing more than a collection of neurons, then if I can look at neurons, and if that is literally a thought, then I'm literally looking at a thought.
Yes.
But if I'm well, right then, if I look at my neurons and I don't see a pink elephant, then my thought of a pink elephant is not the same thing as the correlation of the neurons that are firing when I think of a pink elephant.
If I look at my hard drive and I don't see a video of a basketball, therefore there's no video of a basketball on my hard drive. Again, we're back to the same thing. Just because I can look at your brain, I can look at your thought, and I can see that is in fact the thought. That's what I mean by the thought, is this neural connections. Now, I can't tell you necessarily what those neural connections correlate to, not necessarily, but I can maybe come close. And people have done these studies. I can.
So let's. So I'll move on for the sake of time. And I appreciate you sharing that about Alzheimer's, and I'm sorry to hear that. I can't imagine. So I do imagine that's a sensitive issue. So I don't. But in that field, we won't have to bring up anyone specific. So you said that they would literally be a different person. I assume you're saying because their thoughts and beliefs are changing, am I getting that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So if that makes you a different person, then you're literally a different person that started this debate because you now have a different set of perhaps thoughts, beliefs, and experiences. Is that right?
Yeah.
So since we started talking, how many atoms have I been talking to?
How many atoms? Well, so this goes back to the Native American saying, you never step in the same stream twice. I mean, it is true that I'm not the same. My hair is slightly longer now than it was an hour ago. I have sweat in some of that sweater. I've expired. So liquid has come up. But now, before, at the beginning of this conversation, I would have said, well, that's me because it's in me. I'm made up of this. I'm 80-something% liquid. But now it's not. It's in the air. My air conditioner is pulling it out of the room. So yeah, I'm
right.
But the same.
Right. So then I had been talking to a different number of atoms since we talked. So let me appeal to Jaguan Kim's argument. So in 2011, did you exist?
Did I exist? So now we have to get into what do you mean by I? Give me a
Right.
give me a good thorough definition of I, and I can answer that question for you.
The self.
The self. That's not a good thorough definition. That's just a different label.
Well, what is when you understand what it means to be a self, a conscious subject?
So all you're saying is that's a good definition if you understand it. Well, I don't. I don't know what you mean by I or the self. You're gonna have to tell me more. So
Well,
if
okay.
you say,
Well, let me ask you. So, how would you define the I, and then maybe we can work with that. What is the I? When you use the indexical word I, what are you referring to?
depends an awful lot on the context. It really depends on the context.
This context.
In this context, in well, in this context, this is a formal debate, which is actually part of the reason why I'm giving you this pushback. If we were having a casual conversation, if you and I went to a bar and hung out and had a beer, I wouldn't hold your feet to the fire because I would be in a very different context. But in the context of formal debate, I will hold you. I'll say you need to give me a clearer definition of what you mean. And so some sense of I is still the same because I think that it's useful to talk about continuity of yes, emergent phenomena. If a wave is traveling down, I was at the Dead Sea yesterday, as I told Caleb, and there were little waves. So a wave was coming towards me now, and there are very many waves in the Dead Sea, little ones. Okay, now is that wave as it moves is actually made of different atoms. 30 feet out and 10 feet out, there is no commonality of physical things that are still the same. And yet I can say that's a wave. I can watch it and trace it as it moves along. And yet it's completely different physical things. So is that
right? But that's
wave or the same wave?
Yes, yes, because it's an aggregate. It's a collection of water molecules, and yes, it's
Sure.
changing.
And I'm an aggregate too.
Okay, so right, so I go back to my question based on the argument Jaguar and Kim gave. If you're identical or reducible to just your brain and body aggregate, then you're going to have to say you did not exist in 2011.
I mean, so again, when the wave is coming towards me, you're saying that by this argument, you're saying I have to say that this is a different wave when it's 10 feet out because it's made of different things. Now, I've been to the beach. So really, have you been surfing before? Have you been surfing before and you watch a wave coming? And I have seen lots of people do this. I've been in these conversations where I say, hey, that's a good wave. That's a good one. Let's watch it. Let's try to get that one when it's a far distance out. Now, when it gets to, it's completely different atoms. I've never once had somebody say, oh, no, this is a different wave.
Well, so like you said, so like you said, context matters. So in this context, so there's loose identity and then a strict sense of identity. So we can, one of the things I said I wanted to bring up. So like you look at, there are things that we externally give functional definitions to that don't have an intrinsic identity. For example, money it's just a piece of paper. It has no intrinsic value. And these are things we externally impose on them. So these are kind of things that, and it depends, even if you hold to like a nihilism when it comes to Mariology, but setting that aside, that's the point. So if we're talking about, we can say in a loose sense, it's a quote, same wave, but we're not saying that it's literally the same thing or the same wave. So again, if you're a different person, then you're going to have to concede that in 2011 you didn't exist. It was just someone that looked like you, but it wasn't you, right?
I concede that I didn't exist in 2011 in the same way that I would concede that a wave, when it's right next to me, is different than that same wave 30 feet out. I am perfectly comfortable watching a wave come into shore and saying that is one wave and calling it a wave and saying it's the same wave. If you are going to insist that I must say it is different because it's made of different things, okay, fine. I agree. It's made of different things.
Okay. What about free will? I don't know if you have a position on it, and if you don't, that's fine. But what's your position on free will?
Yeah, that's something I don't really have a particularly strong position on. I would have to get really deep into sort of probability theory and how atomic physics works, and I think that's probably a little beyond the scope of the couple minutes that we have. Sorry, maybe sometime over beer.
No, sure. But there's a difference between an epistemic, whether or not I know something, versus whether or not something's a case. So whether or not we know or can predict is irrelevant as to whether or not there is or is not free will. Even if determinism is true, or even if there is free will, just because we don't know the probabilities of it doesn't invalidate the ontological objective fact of whether or not there is or is not free will. So, but what's interesting here is that, so saying that you don't have a position on it or something like that, which is fine and it's fair, but it seems like by implication you're saying that you have not, that you're trying to be rationally careful in making a decision, and that you would need time to freely analyze all the data in order to come to a rational conclusion, which would assume free will, would it not?
Not necessarily, because, okay, so let's take the opposite side of that. So if there is no free will, then my having said what I just said wasn't a matter of free will, and the sounds that I made that correlated with those words was just because of the determinism, which, by the way, as I said before, we actually know that determinism is not true. So I reject determinism. But yeah, I mean, that can go either way. So yeah, I don't have a particularly strong position on free will. But no, that does not assume that free will exists.
Well, okay, but I want to jump to, you said we know determinism is not true. How's that?
So as I said, with nuclear, the technical aspects is, again, way beyond the scope of this conversation. But so if I have a particular atom of uranium, neither I nor anybody else can tell you exactly when that specific atom will decay. That is not physically possible. That determinism would say you have to be able to say when that happens.
No, I'd have to push back here. So determinism isn't the view that you can predict or know. Whether or not I know, there's going to be something determined to happen. Even if before we ever had the technology to forecast the weather and predict it, it didn't mean that it's not
sorry,
like
I'm interrupting. There's a very common misunderstanding. No, it's not about us knowing. It's not, when I say I can't tell you that this atom, and I get this is just it's a difficulty of language. I'm not saying I, Adam Redwine, can't tell you, and I'm not even saying that the community of scientists can't tell you. I'm saying the universe cannot tell you. We know for a fact that it is not ontologically possible to have this thing be determined. This is a known fact about physics. It's not a question of our ability. This is how the universe behaves.
Do you not hold to the law of causal closure?
You're gonna have to give me that again. I know you talked about it at the end. But
1 minute left for Eric's Q&A.
Every physical event has a necessary prior physical cause.
I mean, again, I'm a physicalist, so I think any cause that exists is physical, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's determined.
Well, not necessarily, no. But I mean, so I'm actually going to allude to your opening. If you can explain that we know how things work, and if everything is going to have a prior physical cause, and if you're just physical, then you're going to necessarily be caused by the chemistry and physics and the laws of chemistry and physics that are happening, and you're not the first mover of your thoughts, beliefs, or actions. So your very belief that there is no soul is itself a belief that you were causally determined to believe, and it might not even necessarily be true. You're just determined to believe it's true, even if it's false, right?
So if determinism were true, then you would be determined to believe it. Yeah, but no, it's not true that the lack of determinism, or sorry, look, if I had, this is Schrodinger's cat, famous thought experiment. If you have a bottle of cyanide that is triggered by the particular radioactive decay with a 50% probability of decaying, and the box is sealed away, you don't know whether the cat is alive or dead. So the cat's state of live or dead is a function of this decay, but the decay itself is uncertain. So it's not, there is inherent uncertainty in how the universe operates. That's not necessarily, I wasn't a necessary outcome of how the universe is.
Okay, so now it's time for us to switch and Adam's cross-examine to Eric.
My cross-examine, all right. Sorry, let me clear this, stop, reset, start. Okay. So I think I wrote a couple questions. Immaterial. This is a big one. You've talked quite a bit about how you call the soul an immaterial thing. To me, that concept doesn't even make sense. I don't know what you mean by immaterial, because humans are physical, and you said this is just, it was an assertion of mine. I say the body is physical. I mean, do you not agree that you are a physical body? Well, I know that you believe that there's a soul or whatever, but don't you claim that the soul is in addition? I mean, you recognize that you do have some physical aspect of yourself, right?
I think it was in one of the slides where I said I am a soul, but I have a body. So as an immaterial substance, yeah, there are things I possess, and then it's even deeper, even in a more technical sense, like in something like a Traducian view, the deep integration and relation between the body and soul. But I would say, as I said in my opening, I am not identical nor reducible to a body. In other words, here's might be a way to think about it. I am at least possibly disembodiable, but my body
Okay.
is not possibly disembodiable. So I am not the same thing as my body.
Okay. Uh, Fair enough. So you say you're not the same thing. Okay, fine, but you accept that parts at least of your body are in fact you. So your heart is maybe replaceable. We can put an artificial circulatory system in you or something, and you're still you, sure, but the heart that's in you right now, I mean, you don't think that heart is a part of you. You think it's something that is external to you, or is it
What was the last thing?
sorry, is your physical body something that is intrinsically a part of you? You say that you may be separable from your body, but I mean, your heart doesn't belong to me. It's not mine.
Right.
It's in your chest. It's not yours.
So then we get into part to whole relationships, and then like I mentioned earlier, so that you can have contingent properties and parts that are not necessary to be who I am, but that would just go to show that I'm more than my parts. In fact, another distinction between aggregates and a substance is that and don't let me ramble. If you think I'm rambling, by all means, please interrupt. So for substances, you have the whole existing ontologically prior to its parts, whereas for aggregates, the parts exist ontologically prior to the whole. And I'll explain that. So if I take a tire off of a car, its existence and identity as a tire still remains the same, which shows us that its existence and identity as a tire is not necessarily dependent on its connection to the whole. Contrast that with the substance. If you cut my arm off, it loses its identity as my arm because it's the whole that gave it its existence and identity. And we know this is the case because within a few days, it's going to decay and cease to exist.
Okay. All right. So in somewhat of a similar vein, I guess, on the subject of immaterial, you talked about the soul influencing the body. What do you mean by influence? I'm particularly like you to sort of address the example I gave about the coin flipping and how a coin flipping 50% of the time was, fair coin, and then we see it now at 75% and 25%. And that's how I understand what we mean by words like influence. When you say the soul influences the body, what do you mean? What's different about how body behaves with a soul versus how body behaves without a soul?
If I said it, could you remind me when I said I'm not saying I didn't. I'm trying to think, trying to remember the context.
Maybe influence was in the previous way. So, I mean, okay. So, would you argue that a soul does not influence a body?
I would. So this might open up another can of worms, but I would say the soul is actually what drives the formation of the body.
Okay. I mean, so you talk about the soul and say, the soul. I'm trying to think. You are a physical person. Obviously, you think you're more than that, but you're sitting there. You're dressed. You are saying words. You are pushing air out of your lungs through your larynx and making sounds. I argue that action, this is a physical thing, speech. Okay, I would argue that action is driven by the neurons and synapses in your brain, or whatever, and that's it. That's the causality is through your brain and into your body, and you move, and your muscles move. You think that there's some extra step in there. I mean, I expect that you and I both agree that on the physicality of speech, and then you go to the brain, and then there's one extra step that you add in. I want to understand what you mean by this sort of extra thing that you add, and how those last two steps in your version interact with each other.
Yeah. So so as a soul with a body, I would say that I am what causes. So I think you would agree with me that if I move my finger, what happened before that finger move was a brain firing, correct?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So the question would be, what caused that brain firing to fire? And here's where I say that I at least have the possibility of libertarian free wills, because I have something that transcends the body, namely the soul, that can act upon the body. So, and I think this would even go into something like, you look at neuroplasticity, and more specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, where I think it was, I forget the guy's name, who's a neuroscientist, that says,
Skinner.
but
Yeah, Skinner.
no, it's someone recent, but basically said, nothing in the brain changes unless neurons change, and basically, so you look at something like OCD or depression, anxiety. These are states and sensations and emotions that I would concede are at times causally determined by the brain. In other words, I don't choose to have anxiety, or I don't choose to have ADHD, which I do have. It's something imposed upon me. Nevertheless, you look at something like cognitive behavioral therapy and what we know about neuroplasticity. Jeffrey Schwartz did this. It basically prescribes his patients, who's one of the leading neuroscientists on these issues, wrote a book called You're Not Your Brain. And by literally thinking differently, you can change the wiring and chemistry of your brain. Now, what I think this shows us is that that if you're just a brain and body, you're just going to continually think and feel the same way based on the dispositions of your brain. But if you have the ability to counteract and go against these habitual, causally influenced and determine thoughts, beliefs, and emotions, and you have the ability to go against that, then it shows that you're more than a brain and body, and that you have something that would go against those habitual ways of thinking.
No, that doesn't show it at all. So you're saying the fact that a brain can change itself proves that it's not just a brain. Like, no, of course. Yeah, I agree with you that a brain can change itself. I agree. Yes, I understand cognitive behavioral therapy can in fact cause changes. It's actually basically the field of work that my wife is in. Yes, people can change. People do change. Their personality, their behavior, brain chemistry can be altered by just actions without drug chemicals. Okay, fine, I agree. So what? That doesn't prove that it's not physical. I mean, I don't understand how you made that logical leap, saying the brain can change itself, therefore it's not just physical. Like that doesn't follow.
So you understand the physics far better than I do, and I'm perfectly humbled by that, and I have no hesitation to say that. So if I shot a bullet in the air, you know better than I do that it's going to just go in the same direction. But it doesn't have the ability to say, you know what, I don't feel like going up anymore, I'm going to go ahead and swerve left for a change. It's not, because once it goes in motion, it's going to stay in that motion. So in principle, take that same thing about the brain and the way it's wired. What makes it change and go against the way it's wired to think?
So a volcano is a large mountain. What makes it change and erupt? Does a volcano have volition or free will just because it changes? No, the fact of something changing doesn't mean that it's has some immaterial thing that's driving it. If I could change the way in which the synapses fire, if I could alter the interaction of the electrons in the synapses, and if you could show that, then maybe I would be inclined to agree with you. But again, as I said before, if you could show that the way an electron behaves inside of a human brain is different than the way an electron behaves in a computer, you will win a Nobel Prize and be extraordinarily wealthy and famous, because that's just, as far as every test that's ever been done, that's never been shown. That's just not how the universe works.
So I'm not saying changes show that there's free will or a soul. I'm saying that, again, go back to the bullet illustration. If a bullet's going straight, but all of a sudden, let's say it goes left, you and I would both assume, and I think rightly so, that there is something physical that interacted upon that, because it doesn't move on its own. It's not a first mover, right?
Yeah.
And that matter is not going to act. It can only move it unless it's acted upon.
Yeah,
would you agree
exactly.
With that?
Okay.
Right. So if you have a brain, that a Coke machine's not going to choose to sing me a song instead of give me a Coke.
Sure. Yep.
Right. So if I'm just a brain and body wired to be a certain way, and if it's possible for me to change that, then I would say I'm not just a bullet, so to speak.
But then here again, you're getting into category error when you talk about if it's possible for me to change that. Well, then you have to know, what do you mean by me? again, to me, when you say it's possible for me to change it, the me that you mean is my brain. So your statement is equivalent to my brain can change my brain. Like, okay, fine, but that does not imply non-physicality. Anyway, I have another point I want to get to before the
Sure,
time.
go
So
for it. Go for it.
I want to ask you, how would you, this kind of silly analogy I talked about with leprechauns, how would you respond if somebody were to claim leprechauns are real? You can't see them, you can't test for them, they don't change anything about the laws of physics, but they're the cause of rainbows. They're invisible leprechauns. They're totally immaterial, non-physical. They don't do anything about it. All the physics is totally the same. But the reason that rainbows exist, the cause of a rainbow, is these invisible leprechauns. How would you respond to that? You're on mute, by the way. Sorry.
So are you? So how would so what you just said? How would that person put it into an argument? So I can understand that better.
So I'm not holding this position. Let me
Yes.
pretend. No, it's fine. Let me pretend to be. Okay. Rainbows are real. We agree on them. There are physics that describe rainbows and how and when rainbows appear. But I am going to tell you the cause of a rainbow is an invisible leprechaun. Now, these invisible leprechauns, they're immaterial. They're non-physical. They can't be detected. They don't alter anything about the laws of physics, but the leprechaun is the cause of a rainbow. So if I'm going to assert that the cause of a rainbow is an invisible, immaterial leprechaun, how do you respond? Do you accept that claim?
No, I would ask a few questions. So to that person, and I know it's obviously like you're playing the leprechaun advocate, if you will. I would ask the person, well, what reason do you have to believe that? What kind of explanatory power does that give? What are you looking to explain that needs to be explaining that can't be explained by X, Y, or Z? Those are the kind of questions I'd ask.
Okay, well, those are the exact same kind of questions I ask you about a soul.
Sure,
Nothing that you have described to me about what you think a soul is in any way improves any sort of description of how a person works or behaves. I have not seen in any of your arguments any explanatory power whatsoever of a soul. It seems to me like a completely superfluous statement. So I would say that your claim of a soul is, to me, how you feel about invisible leprechauns.
Right, and I knew that's where you're going, and I said those answers for that specific reason because I think it's just exact the opposite. When you look at what we know and the arguments that I gave, there, identity through change, which you said which you concede that we're not the same person from one moment to the next. I would say that leads to a position of absurdity because I've been talking to at least maybe 10 different Adams since we started. So it's literally a different person. And now, if you want to hold to that, that's fine. But that I would say at least you're being consistent. The fact that mental
you're the one who's insisting that we have to say it's different. If you are absolutely insistent that I am different now than an hour ago, then I am willing to concede that the physical substance me that I refer to as me, I agree that I am not physically the same as what we started. That's fine. I'm willing to accept that, but the reason I'm willing to accept that is because of your insistence. This isn't something that I necessarily take or assert that I say I fine, if that's how you are. If you want to be pedantic about it, okay, but I don't insist on that. And again, back to the wave analogy, I'm perfectly comfortable saying that wave is traveling towards me and it's still the same wave. I can use language that way. But if you absolutely insist that we have to call it a different wave because it's made of different physical atoms of water, fine, okay. I think that's a very needlessly pedantic position, but you're welcome to take it.
Well, so I'm not trying to be pedantic. So this is just this is what's called essentialism, and you look at the nature of a thing. What I'm saying is that would simply be an implication of physicalism. It's not, me insisting on it. That's just the case. And some philosophers bite the bullet and say, yeah, that's.
So be it. Yes, I am physically different now than I was an hour ago. Yeah, that's a true statement. I can show you proof.
But that's the thing. It's not you different. It's literally a different person that just looks like you. You can't say.
I disagree because to me, when I say me or you say you, when you use those pronouns, I am willing to accept the continuity of the emergent phenomenon. like with the wave, I am willing to accept that a continuous emergent, continuous existence of an emergent phenomenon can involve different physical things, but that does not imply an immaterial aspect to that emergent phenomenon.
All right. Well, that wraps up our cross-examine time. Good discussion, guys. I'm enjoying listening. We're gonna move towards the closing statements now, and we'll start off with Eric, and then Adam will go next. You got about 10 minutes each.
Sorry, I forgot about the closing. So yeah, no, I probably won't use 10 minutes. I'm fine with
Fine.
using the time for more questions. So still haven't heard an argument for physicalism or against the soul. I think the arguments that I gave, based on the 2 points, is that consciousness, mental states and properties are not reducible or identical to physical states or properties of the brain. That alone would show they're not the same thing. You can point to correlations, but correlations don't prove identity. They don't establish identity. So that alone would show that consciousness would have to be something more than physical. And I would even go as far as say it's going to be immaterial. You have things like intentionality. You have the fact that the way we know our mental states are not the same way we know physical states of the brain. You have first-person private access, other things I didn't bring up like qualia. You have the argument from the unified visual field, the indivisibility of personhood. These are things that we know to be true that cannot be explained by something physical. And if you appeal to the physical, it's going to lead to logical absurdities and implications. So it's not at all analogous to leprechauns and rainbows. He even mentioned, go win a Nobel Prize. So these aren't, again, I don't want him to think these are my arguments. These are arguments that are used even by secular atheist philosophers who understand this field. I'm not trying to say Adam doesn't understand it. My point is this isn't arbitrary to me as if I'm making this up. So I think the soul not only provides explanatory power, I don't think it just not only does it have explanatory scope. I think based on what we know to be true, you can even things like I would even argue, so my mental states, I would say, are incorrigible, my sensations, but I can never be wrong about what I'm feeling, but I can be wrong about maybe what body part I have. So there's lots of ways to show that I'm more than a body. And when you use even just you look at the arguments and the syllogisms, if I'm either A or not A, well, it's not A, therefore it's not A. If I'm either a soul, an immaterial substance, or I'm an aggregate, and I can show that I'm not an aggregate through these ways, these are arguments that are deductive arguments that lead to a specific conclusion that, again, consciousness is not physical. And by that, I mean it's not neither reducible nor identical to any state or property of the brain. I am more than a brain and body. And then there were the arguments that I provided there. And I would say based on that, yeah, that is showing that I'm more than something physical. And even Adam conceded that my thoughts aren't true or false. So again, I mean, at this point, I would just be repeating myself, but I appreciate, I want to just go ahead and say I appreciate Adam with the discussion. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate the feedback, the pushback, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Now to Adam's closing statement.
Thanks. I actually have a few slides, even if that's okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I did actually want to bring this back one slide. At the end of my intro, I said I had one slide I was going to save, and I'm glad I did because Eric brought this up, I think, in his rebuttal where he talked about the hard problem of consciousness. Now, the hard problem of consciousness is discussed widely in philosophical circles. I'm really not a fan of it because I honestly think that the problem statement relies on a confusion between a label and an object. The individual consciousness, as I assert, is an object. My consciousness is my brain state. It is the particular arrangement and functioning of my brain synapses. The description of that consciousness, however, is a label. If you put me in an fMRI or whatever, and you look at how my brain behaves, you can come up with all sorts of descriptions of how that works. But all of those descriptions are a label. And the statement of the hard problem of consciousness is that this label never becomes the thing. So you often hear people say, well, no matter how hard a biologist studies your brain, they'll never understand what it's like to be you, to have your thoughts. Well, yeah, of course not, because my consciousness is my physical brain with all of my physical arrangements, and the scientist's brain is in their head, and they're two separate things. I have my brain, it's in here, it's in Israel. Eric has his brain, it's in Texas, and those aren't the same thing. They're two different things, and of course they're not going to become the same thing. All that is a statement of the identity. My brain is my brain, and their brain is their brain. So I don't think that the hard problem of consciousness is hard or a problem, really. I think it's confusion. But the statements are the slides I did actually have for my closing. So just a little recap again of my position. The universe is complex. I often hear, especially Christian apologists, say, you know, the universe is should be understandable, that it should be something that's understandable even by people who have difficulty understanding things and stuff. Well, I don't think that's true. I see no reason to believe that. The universe is not simple. It's not easy to understand. Trust me, I have done an awful lot of physics and taken a lot of classes, and man, they are hard, and they don't get easier. Like, the universe is a really hard thing to understand, but it's our responsibility to learn it. You know, if we want to understand how the universe works, we have to go out there, we have to test, and we have to observe and hypothesize, and be humble and willing to admit when we're wrong, and learn about how these things behave. And also, the universe doesn't care about our labels. So I put in here the ship of Theseus. We use that technical term. And our discussion here didn't really hit on it too strongly, but we talk about, you know, if I'm a person and then I lose my arm, am I still the same person? You say, well, I'm still a person. Yeah, that's fine. And all these discussions can be good and interesting, but the universe itself doesn't care. The universe just is. The resolution to these kinds of problems are just a fuller description. We just need to be more accurate. And I kept saying this with Eric's questions. He kept saying, well, are you the same person? I said, well, you have to tell me what you mean by you. In casual discussion with your friends, you know, we're not going to be insistent that they have to describe and define all these things really well. But if we want a good description of the universe, of this complex universe, we really have to be very, very precise. Modeling complex atoms, single atoms, is difficult. It's really hard. And a brain is composed of trillions upon trillions of them. So, you know, I often hear people say, well, if all we are is material, we should be able to put the equations into a computer and have it tell us how we would behave. Well, no, like, the math is extraordinarily difficult. We have giant supercomputers that try to calculate the behavior of an individual atom. Like, it's not that it's not possible in theory, it's just practically impossible. But the lack of a model doesn't mean that we don't know anything. Like I said, physics can actually positively exclude some things. We can say that there are physical things that we know for a fact that the universe cannot do. It's simply, we can derive a test and say, if the universe behaved in this way, then, you know, we would see X, and we can verify and say, well, the universe does not behave this way. So we can really learn a lot about these kinds of things. Language also is very complex. Like I said, you know, I don't say don't use technical language. I'm just saying you got to be cautious, be really careful. When you hear these kinds of arguments, you need to be as precise with your language as you want your answer to be precise. It's very easy to misunderstand it. To, you know, get a feel for this, if you know, just have misunderstandings is something everybody has. You know, if somebody close to us can misunderstand what we mean, then somebody we don't know so much more so. If you've ever tried to translate to or from a foreign language, you'll know this it's incredibly difficult. I'm currently trying to learn Hebrew. I speak a decent amount of French and Spanish, and man, I can tell you it is really hard to get a good understanding of what words mean. And technical language can be very helpful, but it can also mislead. Very narrow meanings that are applied to words can often have colloquial meaning. So when we talk about energy in physics, we have a very, very specific word meaning for that correlates to a mathematical entity, and we write out in equations. And when a physicist says the energy, we mean this very specific thing in this mathematical equation. But man, I tell you, I see on the internet all the time people talk about, you know, realign your energy, or, you know, this is something that really gives you energy. Like, we use the word energy all the time in English, and we don't at all mean what a physicist means. So you have to be really careful with these kinds of words. But jargon often adds a false sense of reliability. You know, when you hear somebody saying, oh, well, this law of identity proves that therefore there cannot be this other thing. I'm not saying that they're necessarily wrong. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying you got to be cautious. Any of you who are out here listening, this is really directed to the audience more than to Eric or Caleb. Like, just don't take jargon as lending credibility in itself, where you got to really take the time to understand these things. All right, so claims outside of science. So this is back to like the leprechaun thing. If you tell me that a soul has no impact on the universe, then quite frankly, I don't care. If you say your soul exists, but it has no influence at all, and we can't test it, and it's outside the scope of science, then my response is, okay, fine, have fun with that belief, but it's not very convincing. Like, it doesn't matter to me. Claims, because I am physical. This is physical. My hand is physical. My hair is physical. My skin is physical. These are physical things. These are the things that I care about. I care about whether or not I feel pain. I care about whether or not, I'm hungry. I care about these physical things. I don't care about some immaterial thing that has no impact on the universe. Claims about objects that can't be verified. This is just navel gazing. Now, in physics, we can actually distinguish. There's different kinds of things. There's some things that are physically inaccessible. We can't get to the center of the Earth, but maybe we can look at it in other ways. We can inspect it using, earthquakes. Maybe we can look at neutrino science. There's a big neutrino experiment in Antarctica that looks at neutrinos that are coming through the planet. They actually look at the upward-facing neutrinos, and to calibrate that system, they use the shadow of the moon. So we're looking at neutrinos that pass through the moon and then through the Earth and then interact in this glacier. So, just because we say something is inaccessible, so if we say, my thoughts are inaccessible, like, well, maybe we can look at it a different way. It's true that your brain won't be my brain, but an fMRI really can give us a lot of understanding of what's going on inside your head. And you can actually correlate parts of the brain with particular things, and then hold up an image to somebody and ask them, what they're seeing, and have some understanding of whether or not they're telling the truth, or you can have some reasonable ability to predict what a person's being shown based on how their brain operates. So we do have some access to these. There's other objects that are actually theoretically inaccessible. This is actually a jargony thing. So again, be cautious here. But I say events that are outside of our light cone. There are things that are inaccessible by the laws of physics that may exist, but that we have no ability to inspect. And even in this case, I would say, honestly, this is navel gazing. If you want to tell me what's inside of a black hole, there are some physical theories where we say, okay, maybe we can get some information. There's actually a very famous example with Stephen Hawking on that one. But there are some things that pretty much everybody agrees, okay, we're never going to be able to access information about these objects. At that point, I say, that's interesting, that's fun chat or after work discussion with friends, but honestly, I don't care that much about it. Unverifiable claims, this is the realm of fairies and leprechauns. This is, if you're telling me that you can't verify a soul exists with science, that you can perform no tests that will prove a soul exists, then quite frankly, I don't care. I just don't see how that is relevant. And the final point I have, I want to say, yeah, I'm coming in here, quote unquote atheist. I actually don't really like that term. I consider myself agnostic. I'm hopefully showing that I'm a pretty reasonable guy, and I'm willing to admit when I'm wrong, and I don't know everything. I clearly don't know everything. I want to say religion is not always bad. I'm not anti-religion. There are some guys out there who are anti-theists. I am not like that. In terms like soul, these can have very deep cultural significance. I'm not even saying it's a bad term to use. I just want you to be cautious. The imprecision of language is a reality. It's not something you have to be ashamed of. We can admit, that we aren't always precise. Like I said with Eric, I'm willing to accept that I am physically different now than I was an hour ago. I'm willing to use the term and say, yes, I'm still me, the same me I was an hour ago. And I understand that that is imprecise language, and I'm okay with that. Community is an important aspect of religion too, but claiming to know more than you do know is, I think, a form of dishonesty. This is something I see a lot among Christians. I see Christians say, evolution is against the law of entropy. Well, I can assure you it is not. I know a lot about how entropy works. I do these things all the time. It's not against the law of entropy. And to claim that you know such a thing if you don't really understand the physics, I think is a form of dishonesty, and that's something that should be discouraged. And I think stigmatizing doubt is really harmful. This is something that lasted with me for a long time. I grew up in a Christian household, and I saw people talk about doubting Thomas, and they would, say how bad that was. Doubt is helpful. Doubt is useful. Doubt encourages us to check and recheck and be thorough and precise in our behavior and our thoughts. And hopefully this discussion has helped all of us do that a little bit more. So that's what I have to say. And thanks for the invite.
Hey, thanks again, Adam and Eric. This closes our formal time of the debate. And I think this has been a very engaging discussion and hopefully helpful for our viewers and listeners. We're not done yet, though, so stick around, those who are still watching. I hope you guys will go ahead, if you haven't already, put in a question for Adam or Eric or both of them, and we'll put it forth to both of them to answer those questions. So let me look at the chat here. I know we have a few that's already been posted. Give me a second here. All right. This is from Trinity Radio. You aren't an ocean wave, obviously. This is for Adam, sorry. You aren't an ocean wave, obviously. How do you explain the continuity of identity for a conscious agent?
So it's true that I'm not an ocean wave, but I see no reason why that's not a decent analogy. An ocean wave is actually a very complex thing. And I expect that the person who asked that question would agree that a tree is not a conscious entity. I expect they would also agree that the physicality of that tree is different. It changes over time. It grows. Some parts of it die away, and so the physicality changes. And yet, it's perfectly reasonable in our language to say that is the same tree, even though it's not physically identical. Just because it's complex doesn't destroy that analogy, I don't think.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam, for sharing your perspective there. I don't know if Eric, did you want to comment on that one?
Sure. Yeah. If Adam's okay with that. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So a tree is a substance. So the traditional paradigm view of substances take living things as paradigm cases. So a tree would be a substance, and substances are what ground and underlie their changes. They're what ground and underlie all of its capacities and faculties of the thing in question. A wave is an artifact. So I think Trinity Radio's point was on point in that, yeah, but the analogy, of course, for 20 minutes, there's a lot I left out, but like the analogy I use, instead of the ship of Theseus, take a car, you replace the wheels, is it the same car? Replace it, same car. Let's say you replace every single piece of the car, and then you take those replaced pieces and put those back together. You now have two cars. Which one's the original? Whatever your answer is, at the very least, we can all agree that they cannot both be the original, which I think would go to show that purely physical not maintain identity through change. A tree is a substance. A wave is not. So it's disanalogous to compare that to a wave. So I think the question still stands.
Do you have a car, out of curiosity, Eric?
I do actually, and
have you ever changed the tires on it?
Me personally, no.
Well, I mean, have the tires ever been changed?
I just had one changed a few weeks ago. Yeah.
Okay. Is the car with that new tire, is that your car?
Yeah, but now we're talking about an owning in the sense of like a legal. My name's on the title. We're not talking about the identity of the thing itself.
So what you're saying is, if we really want to understand the answer to the paradox, we have to be careful with our language and more precise in the definition of what we mean by your car. Great.
Absolutely. And I think I've been precise. In fact, just a fun fact, it's actually because this is the area I study most. The car that I actually have is called a Kia Soul. And I bought it just so I could make some puns when I teach on the subject. So worth every penny.
It's good. No, in fact, I was going to bring up that. Yeah, I'm glad you did. You talk about it, but this is the whole point I made about the category versus the instance description. Yeah, and like these kinds of confusions, they're good. They're interesting. It's actually the basis of humor. Like we make a joke when our new understanding contradicts the previous understanding. That's the whole structure of a joke. Like, this is part of how humans work. This is okay.
All right, let's go to the next question here. We have from Air Church on Facebook. Question to Adam. We'll start with first. How would you explain near-death experiences that continue to occur long after any brain activity can be detected?
On what basis would this person claim that they continue to occur? So I would say that a near-death activity or a near-death experience is a particular state of the brain. It's a result of the changes in the brain state, because again, I believe that the consciousness is the brain state, and as the brain changes, just like with Alzheimer's, it changes, your personality. It is equivalent to an experience. So a near-death experience is an experience in the same way that anything else is an experience. It's a change in your brain state. And I would say that your brain changes. And I would say that when the brain activity stops, then it stops. And then if the person comes, is revived, resuscitated, then brain activity resumes, then it resumes, and they may have memory. And the person may claim, hey, my near-death experience continued on, and I went and I saw a light and I went towards it and I, talked with my grandfather or whatever. Okay, well, fine, you can claim that maybe that's your interpretation of what happened, but I'm not convinced that there was actually some temporal aspect of it that was outside of the continuity of brain activity.
All right, Eric, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure how familiar Adam is with near-death experiences. I think they do happen. I don't think you need that to make a case for the soul, but what they were getting at, it seems, and there's been scientific studies done, and of course you can only do so much, but where doctors themselves have signed off. But so there's instances where we know that there's no brain activity at all, there's no brain firings or brain states, and yet people are still able to report something while they're in that state of technically being medically dead and even put under. And there's even there's a lot of interesting cases, and I don't want to take up too much time talking about it, but like, for example, there was one case where this lady had a surgery done that she had, I think it was like a tumor, and it was such a rare condition that I think only 2 other people in the entire world were qualified to do this kind of surgery. And the way they do the surgery is interesting. You have to basically lower, because of where it's at, it's such a radical surgery. They basically have to like put you under, and then they freeze the body. So they have to lower the temperature down slowly, and then they cut the person and take every single ounce of blood out of the person. So the person is dead, no blood in them. The body's frozen at a certain temperature, and they only have a certain time window where they can perform this surgery. And it takes so long. And when the lady came back, they had to put the blood back in at a certain time, slowly raise the temperature back up of the body, then resuscitate her. She was able to describe with such high accuracy how this procedure worked. And this is not something you're going to see on a movie. It's such a rare procedure. The layperson probably has no idea what it is, but she was able to describe it. There's other instances like this where even one doctor said, I could literally take this person's testimony and use it to teach a class. It was so accurate. So I think there's a lot of validity to near-death experiences when there's no brain states or brain function at all happening.
All right, thank you, Eric. I have another question by Scott Hudson, and we'll start again with Adam. He says, do you believe that you stay you over time? What is it about you that stays the same since your physical body is in a constant state of change?
Sure. So like I said, I'm comfortable with using the same pronoun to describe the continuity of an emergent phenomenon. That would include myself, my description of myself. And how I would answer, what is it that stays me? I say, well, so the brain in response to experiences makes changes. In fact, some of my recent academic work is on artificial neural networks. So I have a little bit of understanding in this regard too, that when a particular synaptic connection is something that is reinforced for some reason or another, the strength of that synapse is increased. And when it's something that's not reinforced, it eventually decays away. And so the brain is really a network of these neurons and these connections that are variously strengthened or dying away depending on one's experiences. And so the fact that some of the physical atoms change or some of the molecules change or whatever, even despite that, the structure of these connections tends to stay similar. I would say that structure is what I would say, referring to me as a personality in my consciousness, I would say that continuity of that structure is what I would mean when I would say that I continue being the same person. My brain, even though I expire and I'm not physically exactly the same as I was an hour ago, my brain is pretty darn close to what it was about an hour ago.
All right, thank you, Adam. Eric, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, at this point, I'd just be repeating myself, but if you're just an aggregate reducible to a brain and body, you're not going to maintain the same identity change. I think just it's intuitively and self-evident that we do maintain that there has to be something. What he's getting at is there has to be something that underlies the change. So there has to be some type of continuity and grounding of that identity that's going to help it remain the same throughout change and part replacement. So on Adam's view, not only are you not literally the same person, the same self that you were when you're 5, it's just a look-alike that happens to have your same memories. But if I am the same person, then there has to be something more than physical, and that doesn't just apply to physical parts. You can even, things like memory. If I get hit over the head and lose my memory, and I don't remember who I am, then Adam, I think, would have to say I'm not the same person. But suppose I regain those memories. Did I go out of existence, and then for like about a few days somebody else existed and my wife was in bed with another man, so to speak, and then 3 days later I came back to exist once again? Well, I think it's an absurd conclusion.
I agree that's absurd. I'd really like to address that if I
go for it.
Finish up. I want to address that.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go
for it. So this, I think we had a little bit of this in emails too. So I think that you're actually flipping our positions here. I agree with you that is an absurd conclusion to say, an amnesiac who then regains their memories is stopped existing and then began existing again. I agree. I think that's totally absurd. I don't claim that. In fact, I think that you are the person who has to claim that, because you talk about yourself being the thing that it's the seated in the body, but that yourself is the thing that continues and that drives your I assume your preferences, your tastes, or whatever. So you are the one who's then going to have to claim, well, that thing changed. All I say is that the brain has a particular state and function, and it exists, and it's similar over time, and that similarity is what I mean by the continuity. And then if some accident happened where the person loses, then there's a change in it, and then as they regain memories, the change comes back. And I'm perfectly comfortable with saying that the degree to which the new person now resembles the previous person is variable, and I'm comfortable with this change in ambiguity. And I think that you're the person who makes it a binary. You talked about degreed personhood, and you claim that personhood is not degreed. So you think it's a binary. I don't think it's a binary.
I'm not sure what you mean by binary, and I'm not trying to push back here.
You're saying popping into existence and out of existence. I don't claim that it pops into existence. There is no instant in which it comes or goes. I think it is divisible and can change gradually and slowly. You, on the other hand, claim that it either is or it isn't.
So you think someone could be less of a person than me?
No, I'm saying that you can be less similar to yourself now than you were when you're 7. Some people are very different when they're an adult than they were when a child. Some people are very similar as an adult to how they were as a child.
Right, but
one person that it's continuous and that the person started existing and then stopped existing.
But okay, so I think there might be some confusion of categories here. I'm not saying you're no longer a person. I'm saying with regards to degreed property. So I think you might be unintentionally perhaps confusing two of my arguments. So I'm saying no one's more or less of a person. Just like the number 6 is not more even than the number 2. It either is or it isn't. And I think that's what personhood is. But I don't think people come to be persons or lose being persons. They can fluctuate in other aspects, but I'm just talking specifically about personhood with that particular argument.
Okay, I think we're getting a little bit off, and again, we're confusing the category and instance. I'm not saying that a person becomes more or less of a person. I say they still fit in that category. I'm saying a person becomes more or less of the person that they were. The individual changes, the individual instance of the person changes, and I'm comfortable with these changes. my interpretation of your argument was that you were less comfortable with saying that a person changes.
I have no problem saying that a person can, and this goes back to the necessary properties versus contingent properties. If I dyed my hair, I'm still me, because and it's not essential property of me having this color hair for me to be me. But like, for contrast that with like the number two, it makes no sense to say that the number two could lose the property of being even and still exist as the number two. That's just, that's a
but you claim that you still exist. You claim that you are a soul that has a body. You claim that you continue to exist over time. So I assume you claim that your soul does not change. Do you think that your soul is a constant thing? Does your soul change? Does it, like, how?
Yeah. So this is where it gets more technically, metaphysically technical, where, what possesses states and properties? Well, I say, just for the sake of brevity, substances possess, are one of the things that can possess states and properties. And a substance is not merely a collection of its properties and parts, whereas something like Apollo wood is literally just a collection of properties and parts. So I can lose and gain properties as long as these aren't essential properties, like, okay, so I can lose and gain properties, but I'm not changing because I am not reducible to merely a bundle of properties and parts. So that's what the argument is getting at there.
Okay, well, that's good. I mean, I think that's actually a pretty good distillation of our differences. I take the exact opposite view.
Yeah,
that's helpful. So I got about maybe one or two more questions for you guys, and we'll wrap it up. So I guess I'll start with Adam. Now, you said you reject determinism, and so I'm wondering how do you justify free moral choices? And I guess follow up to that is, do you think that objective morality exists?
I do not think that objective morality exists. And I am honestly often surprised at how insistent typically Christians are that morality must be objective. And then they will often claim that they get their morality from the Bible. Well, go read the Bible and read some of the laws that are in there. There are laws about how much you have to compensate, literally how much, how many shekels does one have to compensate for the death of a farm animal owned by another person. If you're claiming that the Bible is a set of objective moral truth, then you must necessarily then insist that the exchange rate of the Israeli shekel is an absolute universal truth. I think that these kinds of claims are utterly ridiculous. So no, I don't believe that there is an objective morality. I believe that morality is again a human concept, and it's one with a lot of ambiguity. It's a very useful concept. I'm happy to buy into that concept and to discuss it, but it's very much a human construct. And like I said, with free will, that's the kind of thing I don't really have a particularly firm opinion on. I wouldn't say that it's outside the scope of physics. In fact, I personally think that pretty much nothing is outside of the scope of physics, but that's because I'm a physicist. But I would say that free will is not something I put a whole heck of a lot of thought into and don't have a particularly strong opinion on. So as free will relates to morality, I can't give you really a particularly good answer. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Adam. Eric, you want to comment on that?
Yes. So that's an entirely different kind of worms, and I don't want to go into something on morality, but I am a bit shocked that you would say that morality is not objective. But if it's not objective, if morality is nothing but a convention and subjective, then by that own line of logic, you should have no problem with anything the Bible says, because it's just a preferential issue. It's like saying, I ate Taco Bell today, but Adam went to Burger King. Oh my gosh, how can you believe that Adam went to Burger King? Well, it's just a matter of preference. You eat peas with a spoon. I use a fork. Some people use a knife. It's just a matter of preference, because if it's all subjective. But if it's objective, then if you're going to point to something being objectively immoral, then I would say that goes again, it's another kind of worms, and I won't be able to unpack it, but I would say that leads to necessarily that God must exist if there is objective morality. Otherwise, it's just a matter of preference. There can be no moral progress. And I don't make the claim that we, quote, get our morality from the Bible, and neither is that the argument from morality. The argument from morality is simply that if objective morality exists, then God must exist. And if there is no God, there can be no objective morality. But I would at least say Adam's at least consistent in that if he would call himself an atheist, then yeah, I would say then objective morality wouldn't exist, and I can at least applaud him for being consistent there.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for breaking that down. I know that is a whole nother can of worms and a whole nother debate too. I always like to ask this question, almost any topic we're dealing with. Just it's interesting to hear people's response. I want to hear from both of you guys. Who do you think that the historical Jesus is, and what do you think will happen to you after you die? All right, go ahead, Adam.
Sure. Although I started as an art historian and was a history major for a while, I'm not particularly strong in ancient history. My general impression is that it's certainly plausible that there was some individual human who either was known by that name or came to be known by that name. I won't reject that. 2,000 years is a pretty long time. Records are not particularly strong. We can certainly dig up some artifacts and have a decent understanding. I mean, I live in Israel. Like archaeology is a big part of what people do here, and we have some knowledge. But when you talk about like an individual specific person, unless they were a ruler, and quite frankly, even if they were a ruler, we really have a very difficult time giving any particular details. So, was there an individual named Jesus in this area about 2,000 years ago? Maybe. If somebody digs up something tomorrow and says, "Hey, look, here's evidence there was this guy named Jesus," it's not any skin off my nose. But do I think that this historical person, if they existed, do I think that they broke the laws of physics with miracles? No, I do not.
All right, thanks for sharing, Adam. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so we're just opening all kinds of cans of worms right before we end. There's a lot to say, and I don't want to take up a lot of time, to be honest with you. But so, who is the historical Jesus? He was God incarnate, my Savior. He's the one that came, sinless, died on the cross. And historically speaking, we can say, let me put it this way: from history, and based on what we know in history, I would say that we can that we know that God rose Jesus from the dead, and if God rose Jesus from the dead, then Christianity is true. He mentioned that was 2,000 years ago, but that if someone wrote, let's say, an article about our debate tonight and wrote it tonight, just because 2,000 years have passed, that time frame of how long it's been doesn't affect the time of the records we have of what happened, and the records that we have of Christ's life and the history there are very, very close to the actual events. Some of the closest in history, and historians themselves, secular, Christian, or other, would agree with something like that. And then he said, do I think Jesus was someone who wrote the laws of physics? That seems to be a Humean understanding of miracles, which is actually it's something I don't think any scholar holds to these days. That Humean view of miracles that's been well debunked. That's not what miracles are. But again, another can of worms. Jesus, he's someone who existed, who's still alive, who was resurrected. He is my Savior, and I pray Adam comes to know him.
All right. Well, that concludes our time tonight. I really enjoyed this discussion. Adam, I know it was last minute. We had another friend of mine who's going to come in here and debate with Eric, but I think you have done a very good job and provided a very engaging discussion. And thank you also, Eric, for sharing as well. So thank you guys for watching tonight. I hope you guys will like, comment, subscribe the Engage Truth YouTube channel, or check us out on Engage Apologetics, Facebook, or on a Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And please share this podcast with other people, and so you guys can maybe continue that conversation offline. And we have other episodes coming up here in the future and interviews. So hope you guys can check those out. Thanks for watching, guys.